All right, just to make sure, like, can you hear me? Just like thumbs up. Yeah, okay, cool. So I have like quite a bit to get through. So like just like a brief summary of where this debate is going to go. So firstly, I want to talk about why we make things illegal to start with. Secondly, does freedom of choice then come into play in this specific context? We'll talk about the two at the same time. And then like what are the impacts and potential for harm that homeschooling has, and then why that means that we should then make it illegal, based on, the first 2 points. So firstly, on like why we make things illegal, just because like this isn't an actual point. This is kind of just like characterizing the debate, or like what this is going to look like. So like at the point where we make things illegal, given the potential for harm that that thing has, or on like a group of people, then obviously like this is contingent on like my material later in this debate being proven. But like, I mean, I'm pretty confident that that's going to happen. So like, that's cool. So like at the point where homeschooling has like a huge potential for harm to the students that are in that environment, then that is like sufficient reason to make it illegal. So obviously there are some benefits that come to homeschooling. That's fine. But at the point where those benefits do not apply to every single person or even the majority of people in that environment, then that is sufficient reason to ban something. And so then like, do parents have freedom of choice? Like, should they be able to choose to opt into this, that kind of thing? At the point where we recognize that like there is a harm, a huge potential harm to come to this, then we would restrict that freedom of choice in the same way that you would do the same to like for other reasons. And so the examples that I have is like illicit drugs, driving regulations. We get that people should be able to choose to do those things, but at the point where they actively create harm for that person or a group of people, then like that is a reason why we wouldn't allow people to choose to do that thing. And that same thing happens here too. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, like the alcohol and the smoking industry. Obviously, they are very harmful, but we allow people to do that. The reason being is because like it's a huge industry that generates money. Homeschooling doesn't necessarily do that, which means that like when we look at that, that's not a huge reason as to like why we should allow people to have that choice despite the potential harm that it has. And so obviously, before we get into like the actual like meaty stuff, like I'm going to pass it back to you, and then we'll see how this goes.
I believe you argued for net benefits. Are we just making a standard of net benefits? Because if so, I agree.
No, not net benefits. What this is that the potential for harm or benefits that this has is like is why we should like legalize it or not legalize it, at the point where like it has, like it does have some benefits, but those benefits aren't outweighed by harms, and like that's probably sufficient reason to ban something. I mean, that's probably like a really shitty answer, and I do apologize, but like, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm 100% following.
All I would say is that, as with any debate, it should come down to the potential advantages versus the potential harms. So if the potential harms, you can show that they outweigh the potential advantages, then sure, you should win. And if I can show that the potential advantages outweigh the potential harms, I should win.
I mean, given that like it's not necessarily whether this thing is good or bad, is good or bad. It's like arguing about whether it should be illegal or illegal. Like that, there is probably that like extra level of depth. So like, I need to prove that not only it is a bad, like the harms outweigh the benefits, I also need to prove that that is sufficient reason to like outlaw something as well. So like probably the higher burden is on me here, but like, I don't know. Anyway, back to like your intro, I guess, if you have one. If not, just like feel free to pass it back.
Okay. Well, I haven't heard an argument from you yet, so I guess I will go into my speech here. Now, first of all, I want to point out that I was homeschooled for the majority of my early education, actually by an abusive person. So I have seen the positives and negatives of homeschooling, and that is part of the reason why I am a strong advocate for homeschooling. Even having seen the difficulties that can be encountered, I see it as incredibly advantageous. So let me go into why. I have an overall contention, which is that homeschooling is the best form of schooling. I have 3 subpoints here. The first subpoint is out of statistics. A study from Northeastern University found that homeschoolers perform 72 points higher on annual SAT scores. And an HSLDA study found that on yearly standardized tests, homeschoolers outperform 87% of other students, whether public or private schooled. Homeschoolers are doing better than public or private school students. So this is the best way that it should be going. The B point here is that of class size of 1. The reason why homeschooling works is because a class size of 1 is necessarily better than a class size of 30, because you will have an individualized education, which will, of course, yield better results as the teacher is entirely focused on the student. The third subpoint I have is that of tailored education. Every student is going to learn in different ways. In a classroom, all students must follow the same curriculum, but in a homeschool, the curriculum can be specifically tailored to the learning style and skills of the individual. The class size and tailored education are the fundamental reasons why homeschoolers perform so much better than other forms of schooling in any measurable standards. Now, I'm going to go into, I haven't heard any of your arguments yet, but I'm going to present a few disadvantages to the idea of banning homeschooling. The first disadvantage is that of harms students. You can cross-apply my analysis from above. There are 2.3 million homeschoolers. So for them to have a better system of schooling taken away is harmful to all of them. The second disadvantage to the idea of banning homeschooling is that it will cost $27 billion. At least, and that's only in the United States. I know you're in Australia, so it might be more for that. But currently, homeschoolers are paying for their own materials. If you put them into a public school system, $27 billion per year must be added to the already cash-strapped public school system. The third disadvantage is that it harms disabled and bullied children. One of the main reasons why people choose homeschooling is because they're taking kids out of an abusive system and bringing them to an area where they can be protected. There is so much bullying and cruelty that goes on in the public school systems, so parents have been able to protect their kids. I've met kids like this. I've seen it because I was homeschooled myself, so I've seen kids who are being protected from abusive situations. Banning homeschooling sends them back into those abusive situations, so I'd advocate against it.
Yeah, cool. I do that thing on purpose where like I just don't say my arguments until the next person does. I don't know why I do, but like that's just how things work. Okay, so like a few points of rebuttal before I get into like some actual points. So you wanted to say that like studies have shown that homeschool kids do really well. They outperform their public or like institutionalized schooling students. You know, in so many better ways for like a number of reasons. Firstly, because like class size, the tailored learning. The thing that I have to say here is that that is only the students who actually like are homeschooled properly. Now, what that means is that that is in places where homeschooling is regulated, places where it is like not necessarily or not just regulated, but also monitored properly. And the reality is that that's just not the case. Now, how do we know this? Like, I don't know, like, I don't know much about, like, the American schooling system, so, like, these facts could be completely untrue, and, like, if they are, like, this sucks. But, like, in 10 states, homeschooling is completely unregulated, which means that parents have complete control over, like, the education that that student gets, and in another 15 states, they only have to say that that student is being homeschooled, and that's it. Now, why is this bad? This is bad because even in states where, like, this is somewhat more regulated than those other ones, the law gives it like there is no reason for education officials to firstly like administer the tests themselves. Obviously that, you know, applies to some states, but in a lot of other states that's not the case. What happens is these parents administer the test themselves, and then they send the results to wherever it is that they send them, like whatever the organization that manages this. And so at that point, that means that like a lot of those facts, they're probably not completely true, like, or if they are true, it's only those states where this is either regulated or monitored properly, which means that there is a huge number of homeschool kids that actually aren't doing better than their peers simply because their parent, like, there is no proper regulation or monitoring of this. And so like those stats are only those stats would only work for you if that is applicable to every single homeschooled student in any area, which the reality is that they're not. But also, like, I would also say that the schooling system is fucked and that it needs to be changed. I would just say that homeschooling is not a better alternative to that. And then the second thing that you said was that the disadvantages, so to speak, particularly about money. Like, this might cost $27 billion, but like, I don't know what the Americans have just done, but the Australian government just gave like $80 billion of tax cuts to big companies. Like, at the point where like that is enough to fund every single university student in Australia is like HECS debt, we would say that like we just would take that money from them, like in the form of not giving them tax cuts, and therefore like they have that money. But also like the fact that people are disabled and bullied, like that is obviously regrettable, but at the point where like the alternative is far worse. And like, I know I didn't get into any of my arguments, and like, I'm sorry, I'll get into that next time. But yeah.
Well, I think a fundamental part of your case is that you have to show how the alternative is far worse, because we haven't seen anything to suggest that so far. But I'll let you get to that in a few minutes here. Let me first respond to what you have here. You talked about how my case would only work when we're talking about only homeschooling properly. Now, remember, the resolution is that homeschooling should be illegal. So as part of my case, I'm going to focus on how we should have an oversight, not ban. I agree with you that there should be some level of oversight on homeschooling. In fact, in most of the US states, including California, where I was homeschooled, they already have that. They have oversight. So my siblings and I would have to prepare reports every other week and bring them to the accredited teacher who would come and check over what we were doing. I agree with that level of oversight. With that system, we solve your issue. That is what you get when you vote for the negative. That is not what you're going to get when you vote for the affirmative, because your plan is simply to throw the whole system out, even though the whole system is working. You even said that if homeschooling is being done properly, then you agree with me that it works. Well, let's do it properly then. You talk about how there's a huge number of homeschoolers who are doing worse. I have 3 responses to this. The first is that of no counter evidence. You presented nothing to suggest this. You just had your own opinion on this, but you presented no studies, no sources, no nothing on that. Secondly, I will cross-apply the argument of oversight. Through oversight, rather than ban, we were able to solve your issue here. The third response is that of more evidence. Let's take a look at some more things here. There are 2.3 million homeschoolers, or 3.4% of all students in America. I don't know exactly the numbers in Australia, but I'm mainly focusing on America. Despite making up only 3.4% of total students, homeschoolers routinely constitute 25% of Scripps National Spelling Bee finalists, 8% of the National Geographic Bee participants, 20% of the 3M Young Scientist National Challenge, and 8% of the national winners for the USA Mathematical Olympiad. Moreover, according to a University of St. Thomas study, homeschoolers graduate from college at a 66.7% rate, compared to a 57.5% rate for all other students. They graduate from college at a better rate. Not only that, that same study found that they get a higher GPA along the way. Overall, it is much better than the alternative. You then talked about how 27 billion wouldn't be that bad because of tax cuts. It's still bad, especially when you're taking away the better option and then spending $27 billion that we don't need to spend. So the entire crux of your case is that homeschooling is so bad, but all of the evidence says that homeschooling is so much better than the alternative. We really need to see some evidence or something to show why you think this is so bad when everything else tells us it's the best, especially if we simply go with oversight, not a ban.
Okay, so the thing to say there is that, like, we're going to fall into this trap for the whole debate, as I do in all of my debates, simply because the debating style in Australia is very, very different. It's more logic-based, not evidence-based. So, like, I do apologize, and I will do my best. And so that's just, like, a differing thing. But also, like, I never actually said that they're doing worse. I just said that, like, in cases where, like, they are unregulated, there is no way to see whether or not that is actually true. And so those statistics that you showed, that you are so heavily relying on, are only applicable to those people who are regulated, which means that, like, there could potentially be a large amount of people who, like, aren't actually performing better, but the stats show that they are because their parents are the ones who send off those test results. That's not to say that these students are good or bad. That just shows that, like, it's not necessarily something that's true. But okay, so, like, let's give you some actual reasons as to this. Like, at the point where, like, getting into my actual substantive now, like, at what, 7 minutes? Yay, good job, Josh. So at the point where, like, we recognize that, like, teachers are probably far better at teaching than parents. Like, that's just an objective fact, right? Obviously, parents are, like, very good at teaching things like life skills, but at the point where, like, the expertise that teachers have, firstly, because they are subject to accountability, and secondly, because of, like, the training regimes and those kinds of things, their parents just don't get. Like, regardless of class size, like, at the point where class sizes are too much, like, I would also advocate that we just, like, find ways to make them smaller. Like, I don't need to prove that, like, schooling as it is, like, exactly right now is better. Like, I would also support, like, reforming the schooling system to fix those issues, right? But at the point where, like, parents are just not as good at educating, like, that's probably sufficient reason, like, to, like, or part of a sufficient reason to do that. But also, like, at the point where, like, homeschooling isn't regulated or to the same extent that you want it to be, and it's not able to be regulated in that same way, then, like, that leaves the doors for people to, like, and like I really didn't want to get into this, but like the really abusive stuff that happens, right? Like I know that you said in your speech that like you know, like you are a homeschooled student, you know lots of homeschooled students, but at the point where like the harms that come from that, the potential harms that come from that are like actually just like so fucking huge. Like that's probably sufficient reason to like not say that it's a good enough alternative. At the point where like a lot of people obviously like do very well, and then other people don't. Like until we can control literally every single person that homeschools their child, then that means like that is not a good enough reason to like keep that system going. And like I do have like other material, but like I just, 20 minutes is just not long enough, and I keep running out of time. Like I literally have like lots of paper, and so like I am sorry for that. Like I'm still getting used to this.
Yeah, no worries. I know the 3-minute time limit is difficult. Let me go into what you talked about there. You talked about how you're used to debating logic, less on evidence. I understand that. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. However, if you're going to make the claim that homeschooling is so much worse, you need to this isn't something about miracles. If you're much better, I'm also someone who has done both public schooling, private schooling, and homeschooling. I can tell you from personal experience, the numbers are not lying. It absolutely is the case that homeschooling gives a better education. Now, you talked about how my case would only work with the homeschoolers who are being regulated, but that's what I advocated. Exactly. I would advocate that we have some level of oversight on homeschoolers because I saw how it worked in California. I accept that. I do not advocate that homeschooling should be illegal. I accept my side of the resolution, and I say that homeschooling should be accepted with oversight. Now, you talk about how teachers are, quote, probably far better than parents. I have two responses. My first response is that no, because studies actually show otherwise. We've already seen the results of what is happening with homeschooling. It is far better in terms of percentage points than in the regular school systems. My second response is that of why this is. The reason it's happening is because the homeschooling system is so much better set up to suit the students. It is individualized, personalized education, and the specific curriculum is able to fit the needs of that student. If you're in a class with 30 other students, you're all reading the same book. You're all using the same material. But if you're homeschooled, your parents can figure out, oh, hey, this is the sort of material that works for them. And that is why homeschoolers routinely outperform other forms of schooling. You then talked about how there's abusive stuff that happens. Well, I understand this. I mean, as I mentioned in my first speech, I grew up in actually one of those families. I had an abusive parent, but I can tell you it was not homeschooling that caused that problem. It's an abusive person themselves. So my actual response to you on this is we're going to look to another study. Because the difference in the two sides is you are saying that homeschooling must be banned because abuse happens, but you're forgetting that anyone who, once homeschooling is banned, the alternative would then become public schools. So in order for your point to be right, you need to prove that homeschooling is necessarily more abusive than public schooling. Actually, though, Dr. Brian Ray did an analysis on the rates of abuse and found that homeschool students are, quote, significantly less likely to experience sexual abuse than their counterparts in public or private schools, end quote. So unless you can provide counter evidence showing that homeschoolers are more likely to be abused, the point does not stand.
Okay, so like my rebuttal, so to speak, is going to be very, very limited because I think like something happened and I actually missed like the first 2 minutes of that speech. So like, yeah, great. Tech is like doing good things. So, okay. So like you keep talking about oversight, right? The thing with the oversight and like, I was completely unprepared for this. So like the statistics that I have, like I actually don't have any for this. This is more like a logical point of view, right? At the point where like you want to oversee every single homeschooled person in like a country as large as the United States, like that's also going to cost a significant amount of money. Firstly, because like you know, I don't think it's likely that people are going to volunteer. Like I don't know, you just disappeared, but like I'm going to keep going anyway. I think it's highly unlikely that people are going to volunteer to do that, especially because like that's such a large thing, which means that like you have to pay those people, you have to pay for those people to go around to every single homeschooled household and ensure that like that happens. But also that oversight fails at the point where like you cannot regulate every single during every day that happens, right? At the point where like and this likely happens with like company inspections, right? A person will go to a company, inspect like that particular store or whatever, and then like 2 weeks later, like because that company knows that they're not going to be there, then like they're not going to do the correct things for 2 weeks, right? At the point where like that is likely to happen when you cannot like completely regulate all the time, then it's likely that parents will take advantage of that, and like the harms that I'm about to get to will be like proliferated even worse. But at the point where like you wanted to say that it's not homeschool that causes abuse in this environment, it's abusive people. Like that also helps me, given that like abusive people are the ones who are homeschooling their kids, and obviously like teachers do that as well, like a whole bunch of other people do that. The reason why it's worse when abusive parents abuse their kids in homeschooled environments is because like I said earlier, parents are not subject to the same level of accountability as teachers, at the point where like teachers have far more to lose than this, because they are firstly in the public eye, but it's also like can be found out more so than parents who do this to their children, at the point where like children quite often suffer like extreme negligence and abuse from like their parents. And like I'm trying to like not go too far into this just because like obviously your experiences, and I don't want to like be a shit person, but like at the point where like that the potential for that to happen and then go unreported because the parents are not subject to anyone, or because they're only being or monitored like once a week, or like however many times, however often you want that to happen, then that's likely to not stop. But also at the point where like that abuse happens and like it's homeschooled, and then students don't have those support networks to go and talk about it. They firstly don't know it's wrong, but secondly they have no ways to get around that because like they can't escape it.
Okay, so I think I lost you for a few moments there too, but I believe that I heard everything you said, so let's make sure that I believe your first point was that oversight can fail. Now obviously oversight can occasionally fail. So I'm not saying that homeschooling will always work with oversight. But at the same time, the question is not, does homeschooling have to be perfect? Every single educational system will have flaws. Whether public schooling, private schooling, boarding school, homeschool, they will all have flaws. They will all have a few times when they fail. The question is, which ones stack up against each other the best? And the answer is, statistically, homeschooling far outweighs the others. So my second response here is that of homeschooling is safer. I'm not sure if you heard it because I know that we had tech issues, but I presented a study which actually showed the rate of abuse among homeschoolers is significantly lower than it is among public or private schoolers. So I know that you're talking about, and I know you're trying to help. I know your goal is to help protect kids from abuse, but statistically, they are much more likely to be harmed in a public or private school than they are at homeschool. So this is not actually a harm specific to homeschooling, and it's certainly not a justification for making homeschooling illegal. Now, I believe that covers the arguments that you had there. So now I'm going to go back into the disadvantages that I talked about. The first disadvantage was simply that it will be harming so many students. 2.3 million students who are currently able to be given a better education that gives them a better opportunity to succeed later in life. They have better graduation rates from college, better GPAs in college, better SAT scores, better ACT scores, better scores on standardized tests. Every single standard, homeschoolers outperform any other form of schooling. It makes no sense to hurt the education of 2.3 million people, especially because, as the second disadvantage I talked about, the cost of it. You're going to be spending $27 billion more for a worse form of education. That doesn't help anyone. That hurts the taxpayer, that hurts the public schools who now have to allocate more money that they don't even have, and it hurts the homeschoolers in the first place. And the third disadvantage that I had been talking about was that of the harm to those who are disabled. And I know this from personal experience. I've seen people with learning disabilities, people with sometimes with physical disabilities, people who have been abused or bullied in the public school systems or the private school systems, who choose homeschooling because their parents want to give them a better opportunity, a better chance to avoid that abusive system. That's the system you're sending them back into. You're taking away their ability to be protected from those abusive things.
Okay, cool. So, I'm going to rehash this a point about abuse because like it was under nuanced in my last speech. So what I was getting at was that at the point where like you obviously cannot regulate 24/7, it is far more likely that this is going to happen. Now, I heard your study the second time. Admittedly, I didn't get it the first time, but the second but like the study that you wanted to quote says that rates of abuse are lower in homeschool than the schooling system. Like now, there is more than one reason as to why that could be true or false, right? At the point where either the only numbers like this is only applicable to people whose abuse has been reported, at the point where like it is far easier to hide abuse in a homeschooling environment than it is in a public or like any institutionalized school. Like, why is that the case? That is the case because, like I said, parents do not have to answer to someone when they homeschool their children, like to the same extent that teachers do, at the point where like it is far more obvious or like far more easier for people to pick it out for students who have been like who are in the like institutionalized schooling, at the point where like teachers are actually trained to like know this sort of stuff. We are trained to like see when a student is not being fed properly, when like their basic needs are not being met. At the point where like parents are doing that to their students in a homeschooled environment, then like it is far easier to like hide that, especially when like isolation becomes a thing, right? And a lot of students who are homeschooled are like they're not allowed to leave at all, and like I wrote down some examples, but I don't remember exact names. Like quite often you have these students who are so severely like abused that they end up like severely disabled or in some cases dead, and the neighbors had no idea that they even existed because their parents like hid them away from there. But also like in terms of like the disabled argument and bullied and things like that, at the point where like we obviously regret that that's a thing, unless that benefits like the entire group of students who are part of the homeschooled environment, which it doesn't, then like that is no reason as to why like that becomes a thing, right? At the point where like the potential for harm that this has to those students is so great, and like the benefit to a small group of people like is so minimal, like obviously like I don't support students who are being bullied, like continually being bullied. But when the alternative is to being homeschooled and like that is so bad, then like that is not a good enough reason as to why we should justify something for a small group of people when it harms more.
All right, so you had two arguments that I heard there. The first was that the abuse numbers are only reported abuse. Well, the burden of proof on this issue would be on you. You're the one who's trying to say that homeschooling should be illegal. So you need to specifically prove that homeschooling is worse than the alternative, public schooling. But you haven't proven that. In fact, the only statistic we've seen is the one that says that homeschooling is safer than public schools. So this is certainly not proven, and is certainly not a reason to make homeschooling illegal. You then said that the sending children back into abuse, you regret it, but it's only a small percent. Yeah, well, why would you send them back when homeschooling is better in the first place? There's no advantage to doing that. You no longer have any arguments to stand on. You have presented nothing that shows that homeschooling is necessarily or statistically or in any way worse than public or private schooling. So that leads me to my three voting issues. The first voting issue is that of evidence. I know that you're from Australia. You don't normally use evidence, apparently, but it is so important to this round because I have presented so much proof showing that homeschooling is significantly better than any other alternative. It makes no sense to ban the thing that is working better in every single statistical category. The second voting issue is that of oversight versus ban. You are throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. I am saying that even if there's an issue here, we should not be banning it outright. You would put oversight. I'm advocating for that oversight. The same sort of oversight as what I had when I was growing up in California. It is the better way to do it. It is the best stance. Don't throw out the system that is the best when you can simply vote for the con and advocate oversight. The third voting issue is that of a significant detriment. $27 billion while getting a worse form of education, while sending, even if it's a small percentage, you're sending kids back into their systems of abuse. That is despicable. It is disgraceful. It makes no sense. There is no reason to vote for the pro in this resolution. So I would urge a vote for the con. And I'm going to present just an example of how I see this round here. This would be like if the Cleveland Cavaliers coach says, all right, there's 4 seconds left to go. There's a possibility that LeBron James might miss this final shot. So in order to stop that from happening, we're going to kick him off the team. and then maybe J.R. Smith can take this final shot. That makes no sense. You don't throw out the thing that is working the best when the alternative is so much worse. My opponent has presented nothing to show that the alternative is better. I urge a vote for the con.